We're going to move now to a keynote from the deeply impressive and absolutely brilliant Dr. Rebecca Huntley, who is Director of Research at the agency 89 Degrees East. Dr. Rebecca Huntley is also one of Australia's foremost researchers on social trends. Personally, I'm so excited to hear from Dr. Rebecca, as she's going to speak to us about how we can, and the research that 89 Degrees East has done, in shifting social norms. Now, often we think about how we're shifting processes, policies, practice, resource flows. We talk about shifting power dynamics and creating relationships or different relationships. But if we don't attack or think about the deep, deep part of the iceberg, our mental models and our societal norms, everything else we change has the ability to be changed back. So I hope you will join me in welcoming online Dr. Rebecca Huntley to talk about how we're going to shift societal norms.
Hello, it's wonderful to be here with you online. I wish I was there in real life with you. I will remember before I finish speaking to put my email in the chat if we don't have any questions, or if you have any questions and you're shy about the work that I'm about to present. It was really wonderful to hear from the previous panel. In fact, Gender Compass, which is an audience segmentation I'm about to present to you, came out of another project that I was involved in called Climate Compass, and it was climate activists across Australia who use that segmentation to great effect in campaigns and with strategy and on communications, who, when moving into the gender equality space, thought that a similar kind of tool might be useful. I want to acknowledge Plan International, who really supported this work coming up in its first iteration, a range of foundations who funded it, including Minderoo Foundation, Tuala Foundation and Lord Mayor's Foundation. And I want to shout out to Michelle Ryan, who I see online as well, who was part of an extensive steering group of organisations and academics who were really instrumental in ensuring that the Gender Compass was as comprehensive as it could have been. So I really suck at sharing slides, and I've had done so many online things where I've spent 5 minutes mucking with the slides. So thank you very much to the organisers for sharing the slides with me. So here is Gender Compass. I'll go to the next slide and talk and introduce you to the segmentation. Look at all those extraordinary people there. So like I said, while Gender Compass was funded by philanthropy, the organisation that really supported me in the work that I was doing on it and made it happen is Plan International. And Gender Compass is an audience segmentation. So it's a large-scale survey that really divides the community into certain kinds of attitudinal groups around gender equality. And from those attitudes flow a whole range of, deep information about those segments in terms of their demographics, in terms of their what behaviour they're doing, what attitudes they have, what drives their behaviour, where their openness to behaviour change, what media they consume, and a whole range of things. And I'll introduce you to the segments in a minute, but that's the compass as it is. And as you can see, our compass shows that the Australian community divides into 7 segments when it comes to gender equality. Some of the names are pretty obvious about where they sit, and others require a little bit more explanation. And I will say that I'm just sharing a few slides with you today in the 20 minutes that I've got, 20 minutes or so I've got, but the full report is available online through the Plan International website. And I will also say that we've been funded for a second wave of research on Gender Compass, mainly looking at how do we talk and communicate about gender equality with the 7 segments. So stay tuned. Later on in the year, that website will also have a whole lot of resources and tools that any organisation that's looking to communicate with audiences around gender equality can use and adapt. So on the next slide, you'll see that, like I said, I can talk forever about methodology. It's a little bit boring, but just for you to know, it was a survey of about 2,500 Australians aged 16 to mid-70s. We applied gender, age, location quotas. We really were trying to make sure that we had the most diverse sample in that 2.5. So in terms of things like Australians living with disability, in terms of cultural linguistically diverse backgrounds and First Nations women as well. There are always challenges in terms of how limited some of the panels we have to access, which is why further research into audience is so important to make sure that we highlight voices that aren't always highlighted in these large-scale surveys. And we did whatever we could to validate those questions and pre-test the survey with different kinds of audiences before we launched it. If you look on the next slide, you'll see that for those of you who've ever worked with the segmentation, what it is really, I kind of, sometimes I jokingly describe it, it's a little bit like, for Harry Potter fans out there, it's a little bit like a sorting hat. It kind of works out where you kind of sit. And it does that by, largely working out where you sit on a range of critical questions around gender equality. Lots of those statements are put in the survey. The survey was 20 minutes long, as you can imagine just how difficult it was to really narrow down the questions and the domains that we were going to explore, because we did want to cross everything from, attitudes to paid and unpaid work, attitudes to family and domestic violence, attitudes to sport, attitudes to women's leadership, attitudes to care, like it was, as well as like broader attitudes to gender equality values and social norms. So it was quite difficult to shoehorn all of that, and we had to be, it was very difficult. We had to kill our darlings a lot in the process of writing the survey. And all segmentations tend to boil down to how people respond to some critical questions. And this is the first segmentation when I've had, a lot of questions, and that reflects just, the complexity of the area. These questions that determine the segmentation, so how you respond on a 10-point scale to these questions in terms of strongly agree to strongly disagree to being kind of quite ambivalent or uncertain. This is in no way in order of priority, but some of those issues you can imagine are sometimes more formative than others. At the top, one of the key ones is how close or far do you think Australia is from for women achieving the same opportunities and outcomes as men? So that kind of, the gap really, the gender gap, however you want to imagine it, how big you think that is really determines about whether you think government should be investing more in women, about whether, discrimination against women exists, about what drives a whole range of behaviours and outcomes in society, which you may or may not determine are formulated by issues around gender equality. And if you look on the next slide, you'll also see that in some of these questions, it's everything from very big values to kind of, small or significant behaviours, like there's, around statements, there is no harm in men making jokes about women when they're amongst other men. So in a sense, I see these differentiating statements as a kind of a attitudinal to-do list for the sector. What if we shifted or perhaps focused certain segments' behaviour on some of these issues, then we might be able to start to shift the dial. We might be able to stop the polarisation around gender equality, which we see is happening, which I'll talk about in a minute. And we might need to stop some of the more concerning trends that we're seeing in this work, as well as in work more broadly amongst younger men and women in relation to gender equality as well. In the next slide, you will see the segments again, and I want to go a little bit into who they are. This is the big reveal. So on the next slide, thank you very much, slide mover. It's making me very... Here are the trailblazers. I have a bit of a... Even though I'm not in the room, I kind of guess a lot of us, it's a wild guess, but I kind of guess a lot of us are in this group. 19% of the population, strong support for measures to address inequality. Why? Because we know that equality is actually far off. The values, the things that would matter most to us in terms of like broader values beyond gender equality are things like fairness and equality. And this is the segment with the strongest lived experience of gender inequality, almost 3 in 4 people personally experiencing harmful impacts. In terms of demographic skews in this group, and if we extrapolate this to the broader community, 19% of the community, this segment has got intra-segment differences. There are young men, there are women and men in their mid-years, it's not homogenous by any sense, but where the demographics fall out once you shape for the attitudes, there are certain skews, and not surprisingly, you're much more likely to be a cis female, younger, and more likely to identify as LGBTQI plus, and you're more likely to live in a regional area, and that does surprise people, but it's got a little bit to do with the fact that if you fit those other demographic categories, you're far less likely to be able to afford to live in a major city. So we're starting to have a little bit of a flight of young people from cities because of housing affordability. So changing perhaps some of the politics of, outside the major cities in Australia. If you look at the next slide, if you look at the next segment, in a sense, the hopeful segment are in many ways the kind of a little bit like the trailblazers segment, but a bit older. So demographically quite similar, but tend to be in that older category. Still incredibly aware and supportive of measures to address inequality, but in some ways less urgent and insistent than the trailblazer segment, and still really hopeful. And for them, the value of caring for others is as important as fairness and equality. They have experienced harmful impacts of gender inequality. There's a really important through line through the segments about lived experience of gender inequality shaping perception and shaping values around gender inequality more broadly. But for this group, and I think this reflects the skew in terms of their age, they've really experienced discrimination on the basis of gender in relation to perhaps caring for home or family, so discrimination in the workplace in particular around that, and potentially even financial disadvantage. If we look at the next segment and every segmentation, the next segment is a really interesting one. There's always one segment in a segmentation that is a surprise, and one that you identify with as a researcher and personally, and there's always one that makes you very worried. And the conflicted segment for me is an interesting one, not particularly big, but important because it's much more likely to be younger men, urban, educated, and also have come from diverse religious or family backgrounds. They believe that we're very close to achieving gender inequality, but they're also more likely to recognise that they have been actually had benefit, if they're a man, that they've actually benefited from gender inequality. So there's a recognition that we might be reaching a level playing field, but it hasn't always been there. Their values are a bit different, fairness and equality aren't amongst them, but on some attitudes, they actually feel quite strongly and they kind of align with some of the other segments that are more positive about gender equality. But on others, they're quite on the other side. So they are genuinely conflicted. An important group just because they tend to be younger and tend to be raising children. So themselves as, the kind of roles that they play in the workplace and as parents and in the area of unpaid work and care, really important role models and open to thinking about issues about gender equality. So not necessarily fixed. Really interesting segment. The next segment is one we get in every segmentation we have, which is, and it's almost always around that percentage, somewhere between 20 and 25%, very easily tick, somewhat agree or relatively agree with a whole lot of statements about gender equality. They're kind of hopeful, they're positive, but they don't really see this as a huge priority, and they don't necessarily identify gender inequality even when it affects them personally. And they're far more reflective of the general population, although there's a little bit more likely to be cis male in that group. And, I find this segment when I'm doing any segmentation, it could be on climate change, it could be anything, and they're just, in some ways, often politicians call this is the swing voter, the persuadables, the people that you have to get to pay attention, and the relevance and the salience of the issue is really important, is really sometimes difficult to get them to think about, even though they are relatively supportive of the broad principles of gender equality. Now we start to go into some more difficult segments. So batten down the hatches. The next one, again, is another one we always find in every segmentation. In fact, it's always 6%. It doesn't matter what I'm doing, they're indifferent. And a big part of this, they're indifferent about any political or complex issue. They're turning away from it. In other work that we do around media consumption, they, actively avoid anything that even is close to news content. And they just, they're very much closed to the issue. And in some ways it's because they are overwhelmed by a whole lot of other stuff that's happening in their lives, and gender equality is an issue. Doesn't seem kind of personally relevant, or it seems like an issue that's very kind of vexed and complex, and they want to and there's enough of that in their lives. So I kind of understand that segment. The next two segments are interesting in the size of them. The next one is interesting. The size of it was even a little bit of a surprise to me. 17% of the Australian community reject gender inequality. They believe it's no longer an issue, that it's gone too far, that actually the main or the discrimination exists against men. They are, from a values point of view, it is about tradition, norms, rules, and economic security. While there is, the kind of the predictable demographic profile to this group. And remember too, the Trailblazer group is 19, they're 17. So that is very, similarly weighted at either kind of end of the spectrum on this. When we cut the data for the rejected group by age, we found that nearly one in five, nearly 1 in 4, were young men. Now, in comparison, if we look at something like the Climate Compass that this emerged out of, when the rejector segment in the Climate Compass is 9%, if you cut it by age, anybody under 30, 25 goes down to kind of less than 1%. So the rejector segment in climate is far more homogenous, far more older, almost certainly male. The rejector segment as a kind of is more spread across generations. When we saw this, and we looked at this data originally and before we launched the Compass in the middle of last year, we thought it was a bit too high, but then we started to look at some other data that's emerging globally and also out of ANROS and other kinds of work that's looking at young men. And while it's not a kind of avalanche of attitudes, it is an uptick. It's a small but significant increase in young men who are questioning gender equality. There's lots of reasons why that might, complex reasons why that might be the case, but it's certainly something that's also, since we've released the Compass last year, got quite a lot of media attention in different kinds of forms. So just some final things before, I'm just a little bit over time, so final slide, and I know I haven't got time for questions, but I am going to put in the chat right now if you have any questions. I will move actually to the final slide if there's another one. Oh, no, I'd keep going. If there's any more. No, that's it. All right, I'll just quickly take if there's any kind of questions from me from the segmentation. The fuller report is, I'm just going to put my email in there if anybody has any questions about the Gender Compass. We also have cut the whole compass by young men and women as well, and I have a larger piece of work that I'm happy to share around gender inequality, young men and women as well, which also looks at the broad manosphere and some of the really fantastic work that's coming out of Man Cave and Movember about what's driving some of those attitudes amongst young men in particular around gender equality. But yeah, anyway, I might go back to you, Tad, if there's any questions. I don't know. I'm happy to answer or kind of leave you with a bit of an overview of this fantastic piece of work, which is my great privilege to be involved in, and more of this work to come very soon.
Does anyone else have questions before I ask something? Okay. Hi, Rebecca. That was great. You just mentioned the manosphere, and we've seen that like the online radicalisation of young men on the internet is becoming deeply problematic. Do you think that with your next tranche of research, you'll be addressing kind of that problem?
Yes, yeah, and we'll be looking at. Look, there's been a lot of really good work that has articulated what's driving this, and obviously it's complex. What we are looking really to do is how do you talk about gender equality effectively with most of the other segments, and how do you find a way to create a space for young men in particular who might not yet be in that rejected category, but who may feel like they have nowhere really to go to talk about these issues, and could be very easily driven into the online space, as they start to talk about it. Yeah, totally agree, Michelle. There's some fantastic work being done by Brooke. So part of what the next phase of the Gender Compass is going to be testing some messages with young men and women who might be on their way to the rejected category, and we're looking at new methodologies to be able to do that rather than the traditional survey or the traditional focus group. So there are, you do have to think about ways to meet them online in the areas in which they're comfortable. There are certainly no easy answers to this question, but yes, we're hoping to give a range of, in this work that we're doing, some guidance about the right frames and the right approaches. And some of that might also be to the parents, the friends, the colleagues of people who are, perhaps in that or adjacent or moving towards that a rejected category, about how to effectively engage and talk about these questions in a way that doesn't necessarily, drive those young men further into that hole. 17% is big. We're not talking about a dismissible single-digit group there. Wonderful. Thank you very much. Like I said, I've got an email, and I'm really happy to answer any questions and send any more information about the Gender Compass if people are interested. Thanks very much.
That was brilliant, and it's always deeply fascinating and interesting to see this kind of gender demographic breakdown with attitudes, even if it is a bit of a bummer in some aspects. Thank you so much. We are now moving to lunch.